Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first CJCM webinar of the year. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. The Climate Justice Charter Movement will be hosting a series of talks under the banner of Climate Justice Perspectives to Fix the Eskom Crisis. This is our first talk in the series, and the topic of today's talk is Understanding the Eskom Crisis and the Way Forward for the Energy System. Today we have a wonderful panelists. We have Dominic Brown, we have Ferron Pedro, and we have Professor Patrick Bond. Patrick will be joining us quite soon. Ferron will go first to make a 15-minute input, followed by Dominic and then Patrick. And then after they have made their input, we will have some time for discussions. So we'll open the discussion after our panelists have all given their input. So it's my honor to introduce Ferron Pedro. Ferron Pedro is the senior campaigner at 350.org, working on the Green New Eskom campaign, which is being led by the Climate Justice Coalition, which 350 is a member of. Prior to that, she was the Working Class Campaigns Coordinator and Educator for the Southern African Federation of Trade Unions, that's SAFTU, where she was responsible for working with progressive working class formations and linking them with SAFTU affiliates, as well as implementing education programs with SAFTU. She has a master's degree in development studies with her dissertation focusing on popular education in new social movements. She has a background as a student and labor activist, active in the Fees Must Fall and Outsourcing Must Fall in Cape Town, Tshwane, and Johannesburg. Ferron, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. Over to you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me. Hi, Comrade Patrick has joined. Great.
I'm so sorry. Eskom has been screwing with me. We're in load shedding.
The irony, yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me, Climate Justice Charter Movement. I am very happy to be here, and I'd like to just know if you can see just my screen.
Yes, you can see it, Comrade. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so I have taken this presentation from our website, the Green New Eskom website, and sorry, I opened the wrong one. my apologies. I only have 15 minutes and I'm eating into it. Okay, here it is. So my point was that all this stuff is available on the website, and comrades can take a look at it at their leisure, and also edit it. And but all this information is available. Shoot. Sorry, I'm struggling to move over to the next slide. Sorry, Charles.
No, that's fine. These things happen. Just try and reshare again.
Wait, just 1 second. Okay, there. Now I can't see my notes. I thought it was working. Okay. See, maybe I could just read it to you without showing you the thingamajig. Okay. Apologies. But there's a really nice presentation on the website that comrades can take a look at, and there's notes, and I can also share this one with you in the chat after. But essentially, what I'm going to be talking about is the Green New Eskom campaign, which both explains or talks to some of the roots of the crisis that we're facing in, and what we so I'm from 350 africa.org, but we're a member of the Climate Justice Coalition, and what we as the Climate Justice Coalition are calling for is this rapid and just transition to more socially owned renewable energy powered economy, providing clean, safe, and affordable energy for all, with no worker and community left behind in the transition. And we call that, and we think that the anchor of that should be Eskom, and that's why we've called our campaign the Green New Eskom campaign. And we have a number of demands. So there are 18 demands in total, including what I spoke about, a rapid and just transition to socially owned renewable energy, but also demands around removing the constraints to renewable energy put in place by the 2019 IRP, which is the Integrated Resource Plan. One of the ways that all of this becomes so accessible is that there are many, many acronyms, but I think it's so important that we try and get to grips with all this information and have a real say in what's happening. We're demanding policies and incentives to enable locally produced socially owned renewable energy technologies. We want to make sure that there's such a thing as the development and implementation of a green industrialization policy. And we think, where there's local and locally produced renewable energy technology and the components. As CRIVE, the Excluded and Climate Justice Coalition have both demanded, the Green New Eskom campaign is also talking about a radical Green New Deal, which puts South Africans to work, building a more socially and ecologically just future, tackling our deep inequality, unemployment, and poverty. And we think a decorporatized Eskom can play a really important role in this if we build the people's power and take back our public utility for people, not profit. So we obviously know that Eskom is in deep trouble. And this campaign is also about transforming Eskom from a national liability and the biggest polluter on the continent into a national asset and a force for climate justice. So right now, we've got Eskom's old, unreliable, and polluting coal power stations plunging us into rolling blackouts. In fact, many wealthy South Africans are now feeling the pain that people in townships and rural communities have been facing, even when we haven't had rolling blackouts, because of what they call load reduction policies, which a study, the comrades from UJ, I think Comrade Terezi and Comrade Trevor, they've done a study on how this is a racist policy because it targets Black poor communities. But look, no one should have to deal with the lack of energy access. We've seen the results of corruption, gross mismanagement by the ANC government, the corporatization of Eskom with cost recovery models, leading to underinvestment, staggering indebtedness, and which has now become the burden of the working class and poor through astronomical tariff increases, which have happened over time, but now are being proposed yet again. But we can't, and I know people are frustrated, but we can't let go of Eskom. Eskom should be a public utility that's for our benefit and not the benefit of, a few tenderpreneurs with vested interest in the mineral energy complex. The fact is Eskom produces almost 90% of our electricity, and it will have to play a significant role in South Africa's energy sector, including addressing energy poverty and a transition to clean energy. Right now, however, Eskom is the biggest polluter on the African continent. And I don't know if this still stands, but at one point was the biggest polluting power utility on the planet, right? So there's an urgency around Eskom for energy security and energy access, energy poverty, and there's an urgency around Eskom with regards to climate disaster, which is already a reality for many on the African continent, and for all of us, really. So I don't think I need to convince anybody here that we need to transform Eskom. One thing just about the debt and and some of the popular narratives that we hear often. Oh, and Charles, please chair me and tell me when I must stop talking. Okay. One thing that we would like to point out, while recognizing the fundamental problems with a user pay model that treats energy like a commodity rather than a public good, is the notion that we have a culture of non-payment, which is a major contributor to Eskom's debt. Now that, there is the case that people are struggling to be able to pay for electricity, and municipalities, poor communities and municipalities are struggling to pay for electricity. And in our booklet, we have a nice booklet, which I was going to show you, but I can't work out how to use this MacBook and Zoom. But it shows, there's like a graph that shows that poor municipalities and communities are indebted to Eskom at about 30 billion rand, but this pales in comparison with the real sources of debt, which a lot of that, so Medupi and Kusile, which are the two newest coal power plants, they were supposed to cost around 60 billion rand, but because of cost overruns, mismanagement, they've ballooned to a cost of 500 billion. And so that's one big source of Eskom's debt. Another big source of Eskom's debt is the overpriced, irregular and overpriced coal contracts, which Special Investigations Unit showed that there was, an incredible, that perhaps the 2008 load shedding crisis could have been, engineered because the people profited so much off of that crisis, and that resulted in Eskom paying 14 trillion rand in overpriced coal contracts. So that the municipal and community debt is tiny compared to that, to those overpriced coal contracts. And I think that there's an important lesson there around, what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine. When things are really bad, the natural disasters, or there are crises like we're facing with load shedding, the ruling elite and capitalist class often come in and profit off that, and also use the opportunities there, and the lack of faith that the public has in government or in institutions or in public ownership to privatize. So there's some danger and something to learn from that. So yes, so I wanted to make the point around the debt and who's actually, and that myth, or not myth, but like I think incorrect narrative, this culture of non-payment narrative. Because the fact is that working class and poor communities face the brunt of the energy crisis, as the cost of electricity has skyrocketed by over 400% in the last decade, with more increases on the cards, as comrades know. And the free basic electricity allocation, the budget for that, we're seeing shockingly that only 20 to 25% of that allocated money that's supposed to go to municipalities to pay for free basic electricity for quote unquote indigent households, only 20 to 25% actually goes to paying for electricity. So which means Eskom is also not getting that money which they're supposed to be getting. But also people aren't getting the free basic electricity that they're entitled to, and that there's a budget line for. And then, yeah, so the fact that, people are not having access to electricity and that there are these rising costs means that there needs to be something that changes. And there's some excellent proposals that have been made by activists on how to reclaim Eskom as a public utility in the public interest by restructuring its financial models. And these should be seriously considered by those interested in a genuine climate justice agenda. We can't, remove climate action from climate justice. And so part of this must involve the transformation of Eskom. As I said, we're facing these two, crises. Part of this, and in fact, we're facing a third, which is unemployment and inequality and poverty. But part of this must involve a transition to a zero carbon economy with a proper focus on the public benefit of developing public and socially owned renewable energy. that can address inequality, the third thing, inequality, poverty, and unemployment. With the cost of renewable energy technology coming down significantly. So in the last 10 years, the price of electricity from solar declined by 89%, price of onshore wind electricity declined by 70%. There are many good models around how renewable energy is now the most affordable energy source, and that we really should be investing it. But now the thing is, how are we going to do that where it's not just multinational companies that are benefiting from it, but our local economy, communities, and how can we use this opportunity, this reorganization of our economy, which is really based, largely on this mineral energy complex. How are we going to reorganize that so that the majority, the Black working class and poor majority, women and young people in particular, are able to benefit? So, and that is part of what the Green New Eskom campaign is about. Must I wrap up soon? I see your face. Okay. So I'm gonna skip some stuff just to say the final bit here. So yeah, so the way out of this crisis is that we need a green industrialization policy for South Africa to make sure that we produce our own renewable energy, especially in the production of renewable energy technology, where most of in the manufacture of renewable energy technology, where most of the climate jobs will be coming from. There's a new South African renewable energy master plan that's being drafted now, and the draft is expected to come out mid-2023, and a final master plan will come out at the end of the year, so we must intervene in that. Building on important previous campaigns like the 1 million climate jobs campaign, we need a massive skills, jobs, and training program to create opportunities for people in this renewable energy economy and unlock those 1 million climate jobs. And a transformed Eskom can be at the heart of this renewable energy revolution, where households, companies, communities, municipalities, and Eskom work together to produce reliable, affordable, and renewable energy. And I think that links quite closely to what Climate Justice Charter movement has around, or talks about, when it talks about the deep just transition and social ownership of renewable energy. I think there's so much alignment, and we must, sorry, my last thing is always a call to action, so I'm going to say this. We need a united front. I'm always calling for this, and I'm not going to stop. We need a united front of progressive activists who recognize the seriousness and urgency of climate justice, but also that renewable energy doesn't mean privatization and green imperialism, that there is something where we can use this crisis to benefit our communities and the working class. And I'm really heartened by the Cry of the Excluded. I spoke about them earlier, made up of SAFTU, AMCU, Assembly of the Unemployed, and I think United Front, and different groups are part of that. And they're calling for a year of mass action campaign with speak outs and mass education programs. And I think that all people who are serious about climate justice and energy justice should try and participate in that and work so that we can really form a united front for meaningful climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Ferron. If you have a PDF version of the Green New Eskom booklet, please share it in the chat with all in attendance. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to call Comrade Dominic Brown. Dominic Brown is an activist struggling for social, economic, and environmental justice. He currently works at the Alternative Information and Development Center. Dominic, over to you.
Thank you, Charles, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I think there's so much misconceptions around the energy debate right now that it's very useful to have these types of discussions. And I would like to echo much of what Ferron has said in a presentation. And so it allows me to build on it a bit more. But maybe I should start by first of all reaffirming the fact that as AIDC, we recognize that we're facing a climate emergency. We have less than a decade to avert runaway climate catastrophe. I'll put up my video because I think it will help save data. And in South Africa, we are a major greenhouse gas emitter, between the 12th and the 14th biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, depending on who you reference. And a big aspect of our greenhouse gas emissions is the continuation of the mineral energy complex and a high energy intensive, carbon intensive energy sector due to a reliance of coal. And so decarbonizing South Africa's energy sector can go a long way toward shifting South Africa towards a low carbon economy. Of course, the immediate issue is the load shedding crisis. And currently we have a 6 gigawatt energy gap. That means energy demand exceeds energy supply by about 6 gigawatts. And everyone knows load shedding is getting continuously worse. What's behind load shedding is the declining energy availability factor at Eskom. This is the fact that the level of energy that the coal fleet can produce as a percentage of the total installed capacity is sub 60%, and some even are saying 49%. And this year occurs due to massive unplanned outages due to a lack of maintenance and servicing of the fleet, or at least in part. We argue at AIDC that this energy crisis and the crisis at Eskom is a manufactured crisis due to more than 20 years or 25 years of bad policy choices. Following on from the 1980s commercialization of Eskom, it lost its tax exemption status in 1998 on its way to full-blown corporatization in 2001. And basically what this means is that Eskom and other SOEs has to operate in the same way as a private company. And this is what results in the unsustainable financial model at most SOEs. Behind it or underpinning it is, as Ferron indicated, the user pays principle under the full cost recovery model in a context where most people are unable to afford basic services due to mass unemployment and incomparable levels of inequality. It must also be recognized that in 1998, the white paper on energy placed a moratorium on Eskom building any new generative capacity in the hope that the private sector would come in. However, at the time, Eskom was the world leading energy utility. It had an excess supply of energy at the time as the electrification program was still unfolding. And because energy was cheap and in abundance, the private sector didn't come on board. Eskom, however, warned government that within the next 6-7 years, there would be constraints in relation to energy supply and that new generative capacity would be required. Thabo Mbeki, however, blocked that move. Finally, or penultimately, I should say, in the state capture years, to give a false sense of the capacity of the fleet, we ran the fleet excessively hard without doing the maintenance and servicing, culminating in the deep collapse that we're seeing at many of the coal-fired power stations today. I think it's important to remember that with the adoption of the unsustainable financing model, to reiterate what Ferron has said, this has meant that Eskom becomes over-reliant on raising resources through tariffs and or debt. As a result, Eskom didn't have the resources needed to do the necessary maintenance and servicing, yet alone investment in infrastructure and new generative capacity. To deal with the energy crisis, government and the private sector's proposal is to increase the liberalization of the energy sector with increased private sector involvement in energy generation. There are two main ways in which the private sector will come on board. The one way is through the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Procurement Program, which started in 2011. Over the past decade, only 90 projects have closed, bringing on board 5,800 megawatts, less than 8% of total installed capacity, albeit costing or accounting for more than 30% of Eskom's primary generation costs. But there's a bigger issue in terms of bringing energy on board, and that is that bid window 5, in the first instance, very few of the 25 preferred bidders have reached financial close as a result of cutthroat competition, which has meant that the profitability of these IPP projects have declined substantially. And it's important to recognize that private renewable energy producers don't use their own capital to invest in the development of renewable energy projects. They have to, once through the bidding process, winning a preferred bid and a 20-year purchase power agreement, needs to go to banks to show the profitability in order to get capital. And given the declining profitability, none of these, or very few of these, are actually coming to fruition. This is an example and the invariable outcome of the for-profit auction model, and which I'll come to in a bit, and it relates to the problem of the three-fall effect and the questions about whether or not renewable energies is cheap. But before we get there, bid window 6 has come into a whole different set of challenges, with less than 20% of bid window 6, 5,200 megawatts of proposed capacity being able to go ahead, given grid constraints. That is historically and currently, given that South Africa's energy sector has been mainly dependent on coal, the grid capacity is mainly in these areas, and there is not sufficient capacity in the Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, and Western Cape, where there would be greater levels of renewable energies from wind and solar. And already there's not enough or not any wind grid capacity available. Just in terms of the question of renewable energies and its cost, yes, the bidding prices of renewable energies have declined substantially. And here you can see, for example, what's happened with bid window 1 to 4, and with bid window 5 even lower. And this trend happens the world over. And as I was saying before, as you see the bidding prices decline, but input costs, as well as capital expenditure costs not declining at the same rate, is declining the levels, reducing the levels of profitability, and thereby, in fact, disincentivizing the levels of investment in renewable energies that would be required to shift the world and South Africa to a low carbon energy economy. If it's not profitable enough to build, it won't be done for the private sector. The second way in which, so maybe just going back to the REIT. So even if bid window 5 and bid window 6 in the best case scenario could go ahead, you could bring on 2,600 megawatts from bid window 5 and 5,200 megawatts from bid window 6. But this would only come on board after 2 years and wouldn't happen immediately. So there is a time lag. And there's also a question about other questions in relation to renewables that we need to take into consideration. Before we get there, the second major way is through private embedded generation. This is where big companies, mainly probably the energy intensive users group, 27 companies who account for 40% of energy consumed in the country, will develop energy for their own, mainly for their own consumption, and sell excess energy through a feed-in tariff via the national transmission grid. This is really what the unbundling of Eskom is a prerequisite for this process to take place in order for both through the IPPs, private embedded generation, and through rooftop solar and what's called small scale embedded generation to buy electricity indiscriminately. This has two implications. The direct one is that it will result in increased input costs for Eskom. The indirect costs would be declining sales volumes and a declining acceleration of the Eskom death spiral, which would result in massive increased tariffs and require bailouts in the future. In terms of private embedded generation, it's estimated that 1,500 megawatts can come on board by the end of 2023. So out of all of this, the point is that the private sector won't be able to meet the energy needs that we have in terms of scale or in terms of time. And the bigger implications are that it will accelerate the collapse of Eskom. Similarly with municipalities and private individuals or even small-scale socially owned renewable energy sectors, one, we must understand that very few municipalities or individuals will actually be able to develop these off-grid technologies. For instance, for a small household, it would cost between 1,500 Rand and 2,000 Rand per month to install in a context where more than half the population lives on an income of less than 1,335 Rand per month. So it's not feasible, and it would result in increased energy poverty, inequalities, and put the energy supply at greater risk. In terms of the tariffs, just very quickly, because I think everyone is frustrated at the rising tariffs, it's important to recognize that given the unsustainable financing model of Eskom, they almost inevitably have to increase tariffs just to meet operational costs, and then they still have to borrow to meet debt service costs. But there is a way that we can scrap the tariff increase in the first instance by taking some immediate measures. For example, reducing primary energy costs by capping the rising coal prices that Ferron spoke about. We can also renegotiate the purchase power agreements of bid windows 1 to 4 and reduce the prices of IPPs, which currently account for a third of primary energy costs. Over and above that, there's possibilities for debt relief. And here we're speaking about, whilst municipalities have 50 billion Rand out of Eskom's 390 billion Rand debt, which is significant, but just over 10% of its total liabilities. The Government Employees Pension Fund, another state-owned enterprise, on the other hand, has more than 20% of Eskom's total liabilities. And the Government Employees Pension Fund has more than 2.3 trillion Rand in accumulated reserves. This year, the PIC, the asset manager of the GPF, rolled over 13 billion Rand of debt repayments. But it can do much more, given that each year the GPF has more than 50 billion Rand on average in surpluses. Doing these three things, reducing primary energy costs, renegotiating IPPs, and also providing the licensing for diesel, procurement of diesel, could also reduce the cost of diesel, which is going to cost 21 billion Rand for this financial year. This can all allow for the scrapping of the tariff hike. However, if we don't revise and transform Eskom's financing model to end the ending the user pays principle, Eskom will invariably face financial woes in the future. Here's just to show that we're paying more than 33% than we should for diesel. But here's the point. I want to move quickly to solutions. So we're making 3 proposals. In the first instance, we need to plug the energy gap. Secondly, we need to fix the Eskom's power stations and the fleet to stabilize energy supply, and then embark. Once we have stabilized energy supply, Eskom needs to play a leading role in advancing a renewable energy transition. To plug the energy gap, we have to run the open gas cycle turbines. Whilst this is not a indefinite to a long-term solution, it's already running at 800% capacity. It is an interim solution and will be required to reduce at least 2 stages of load shedding. Secondly, we will have to expedite the revamping of Koeberg, which will extend its lifespan by another 20 years and brings in just another 2 gigawatts of generative capacity. And 3, in the immediate term, we have to fix the bold defects at Medupi and Kusile. This includes the boiler defects at Kusile units 1, 2, and 3, and fixing Medupi units 5 and 6. Together, doing this, as well as building a temporary chimney, given the collapse of a 220-meter high chimney at Kusile Unit 1, would allow us to bring on another 4.4 gigawatts of energy, which together with Koeberg and the open gas cycle turbines can plug the energy gap within the next 12 to 24 months. This goes to show that there's no real need for an expensive car powership deal, which in itself would take, even if expedited, 12 to 18 months to become operational. Secondly, over the medium term, I'm wrapping up, we have to fix the fleet. And it's not simply a case of old, unreliable coal-fired power stations. Age is not the only and not necessarily the primary factor leading to the declining performance of some of the coal-fired power stations. Corruption, mismanagement, and other political issues, instead of technical ones, are in fact greater impediments. And so prioritizing fixing some of the fleet, and it requires to be taken offline for a considerable period of time for the deep maintenance needed, and prioritizing the ones that have high levels of generative capacity but low energy availability factors could help to stabilize energy supply by over the next 2 years after plugging the energy gap. Importantly, Eskom will need to be allowed to procure manufacturing equipment, in-source maintenance, and other issues, including the public disclosure of contracts, to try and mitigate against corruption and patronage networks. This lays the basis for a transformed Eskom to play a leading role in advancing a renewable energy transition. I think there's a number of other important things that we can pick up on during the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Dominic. We'll pick up on some of the stuff during the discussion. Thank you so much for a very enlightening presentation. Next, we have Patrick Bond. Patrick Bond is a political economist and political ecologist. He teaches at the University of Johannesburg, where he is a distinguished professor. His doctoral studies in geography, environmental engineering at Johns Hopkins University were under the supervision of David Harvey. He learned radical politics in the anti-apartheid labor, student, and community movements. And after moving to South Africa in 1989, he initially served as a researcher within urban social movements, and in 1994 and 1996, worked in the Reconstruction and Development Ministry within President Nelson Mandela's office, and was among those who drafted the first democratic country's white paper and other policies. He has subsequently worked with labor, community, environmental, feminist, and youth movements while teaching at VETS, UKZN, and UWC. His best-known work is Elite Transition from Apartheid to Neoliberalism in South Africa, and has co-authored or co-edited 5 books on the climate crisis. Professor, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Comrade, do I not get what is this, Professor? I'm hoping I can. My ambition is to be the comrade of CJCM and CJC and all of you fantastic people that are building the climate justice ideology. I think there are a half dozen areas where I can add, but really everything that has been said thus far has been absolutely fantastic. Now, I might be having the same problem. No, I think I can manage just to say a half dozen things and then work through them. And I've only got about 10 slides this time, don't worry. And I'll do it, is it about 12 minutes I've got? One is, I don't think we work enough on what Dominic called the EIUG, Energy Intensive Users Group, and demand side management, the abuse of our electricity by multinational corporates. Second, we're gonna have to deal with something that comrades are too slow so far to pick up on, and that's the climate sanctions, which I call a broken stick. It's not yet a strong stick. Do we want climate sanctions against our enemies, the EIUG and Eskom, and maybe big methane gas suppliers, especially blood methane from Mozambique? Third, although it was just mentioned in passing in the prior wonderful article by Dominic, I think actually working the odious debt angle on the Medupi and Kusile loans, that's most of the 400 billion, would be appropriate. I would do that, Comrade Dominic, before going to a pension fund that's a little bit shaky, the government employees pension fund. A fourth area, which I can just outline a little bit more, is what's wrong with this JET-P, the rotten carrot that goes with that broken stick. And then we could talk more, if you feel like, about the privatization of the air. What? The privatization of the air is the carbon market and offset scamming and many of the net zero strategies you're hearing from the big corporates, who are now trying to do what's called wheeling from the renewables that they're financing. And I'll add to what Dominic said about the dangers of the privatization of Eskom, not just generation, but transmission. And then where we can go with cross-subsidization and a fair allocation. So these are areas that really aren't covered very well by you comrades and by the experts, by the journalists, the commentators, by my people, academics, right? How often have you heard about these EIUG, 27 companies that consume 40% of our electricity, only produce 20% of GDP and probably fewer than 5% of the jobs in the country because they're very capital intensive? Who are they? The biggest consumers, BHP Billiton, at over 7% of the grid when it's running its South 32 smelter, the aluminium smelter. What they do, starting in 1992, when Eskom had that big surplus, is to import bauxite from Australia or Guinea, and they zap it with the coal-fired power, and then they mostly export it. Sometimes it goes into, okay, I drink a little bit of beer in a can. That's not a good use of that electricity, is it? I throw it away. Maybe it gets recycled by the recyclers. But that is a particularly appalling version because of special pricing agreements that were set up in 1992 by a guy called Mick Davis, the treasurer of Eskom, and were continued by Vali Musa when he was the chair. Those are probably at 10%. We're never quite sure because of the different pricing functions of electricity and the main smelter outputs like aluminium and steel and platinum and gold and manganese. But those special pricing agreements, which Eskom keeps very quiet, apply to the biggest mining house in the world and the biggest company in Africa's history, Anglo-American. And those are some of the things that I think Ferron was right to say, let's check in on what these pricing systems are. Because big business, and especially the EIUG, the energy intensive users groups, they've had massive power in setting up especially the IRPs that Ferron talked about, the integrated resource plans for what kind of electricity is produced. Now, they've made a decision in the mid-2010s to start augmenting Eskom with their own mega renewable projects. But that brings us to the other problem that Dominic mentioned, which is that we've run out of transmission capacity from the two areas, the Western Cape, the Northern Cape, that have the best solar, right, especially concentrated solar power, which means you can't even start those 5 and 6 IPPs, regardless that the IPPs are a terrible way to generate solar because you get a very high profit markup, especially on the first couple of stages. But also the profits typically will go abroad, and that will put pressure on our balance of payments. We've gone from a surplus, especially with profits, interest, and dividends, that now we have to pay to those European solar and wind companies. So there are a lot of problems with our failure to come to grips with the characteristics of the demand side. And while we're doing rationing by time, the load shedding that I'm suffering now, we're failing to do the rationing by function. And you could go to Paris, for example, the last few weeks, and you'd see the Eiffel Tower turned off at night. Why are we not having those debates about the merits? And I would argue, and I can demonstrate it with all the environmental economic proof, that by giving so much to mining and smelting and these EIUG, 40% of the grid, we're not only producing just 20% of GDP, but when you then add that the negative part of mining, which is that the depletion of our non-renewable wealth, right, the minerals that we cannot grow back, they go out. And that means it's actually a net negative. So if we do a full cost benefit analysis of who uses electricity, I would really rather, I'm sure you would too, get that electricity to a rural woman who therefore won't need to have dirty paraffin and wood and coal in her house, and the particulates that go with it, hence the spread of, say, COVID or other respiratory diseases. TB is still rife. That brings me to why it's very important that we grapple with pricing, because we haven't really done that properly, have we? We don't like taxes. We don't like the ways in which they're organized in a regressive way, right? For example, corporate taxes were 52% at the end of apartheid, and now they're 27%. And that was theoretically to incentivize big capital to invest more. It didn't do that, but really record low levels of fixed capital investment. And what we know of corporate behavior, if you go to a treasury of some big South African corporate, it's putting its profits where it can't get them out of the country. If there are still residual exchange controls, it puts them into the stock market, which is at an all-time high, while fixed investments at an all-time low. Now, that kind of regressive taxation is what neoliberal nationalists in the ANC and the Treasury have been really good at. And unfortunately, the same is true with the carbon price. It's only 35 cents per ton. That's US dollars. So we're going to measure in US because they all do that now. The US has gone up to $51 since Trump. He put it at 1 and Biden put it at 51, but their environmental authority just said, no, it should be $185. The European Union, for their carbon tax, say it's about $100. They have this casino called the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme. And then we've got Sweden at $132 as the highest single site of a carbon tax. In China, it's about $10. In California, it's $18 in their emissions trading. Now, what I'm trying to get at is we need a much, much higher one. 35 cents, I mean, that's just absurd. Tokenism, like so many ANC policies. And so that means we need to figure out, so we don't kind of have a yellow vest or Ecuadorian rising against a carbon tax. We need to figure out how to make that fair for the carbon tax that would be applied on petrol, because rural people, or especially poor urban dwellers, due to apartheid, live a long way away. And we need, therefore, to have a right to electricity and to petrol and to the things. And I would say, we'll come back to it, we should expand our free basic electricity demands. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is the sanctions that the EU is going to put in. They're going to start it in August, but it'll really kick in 2026. And if ours is 35 cents a ton US, and theirs at that point is $150 a ton, say 2026, which is a good guess, then they're going to just smash everything that comes from South Africa into their countries. For a good logic. I mean, yes, they're imperialists. Okay, they'll take what they can and put their burden onto us, of course. But for our exports, they'll have much higher emissions levels. And so the Europeans say, well, we don't want to have a situation where we've put on higher carbon taxes and then importers will cheat by taking South African goods where the regulatory system and climate and carbon taxes are pathetic, right? So they're putting on a CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, as a climate sanctions against our exports. It's probably going to hit half of our exports. And you could see Barbara Creasy writing about it today in Daily Maverick as the main rationale. Our bourgeoisie is very worried about this, right? Our capitalists and also our government leaders, they always mention the CBAM. So let's get used to it. No one's been brave enough. And especially I ask my dear comrades in labor, what do you think about this? Some of you will be hurt. Obviously, you need to demand a just transition. And that if the CBAM hits your sector, if you're a steel worker, an aluminium worker, a manganese worker, or an auto worker with high carbon inputs into the energy that goes into your products for sale, well, you need a just transition more rapidly. And the Europeans should be paying for it because they owe a climate debt, as do we. Now, the odious debt that the North has imposed on us is very important, isn't it? Because they're asking us, you and me, and Enoch Godongwana is going to say, not just you and me as electricity, but next week he's going to say taxpayers, with about 200 billion, maybe even more, of Eskom's debt will now be put into the taxpayers' burden on our shoulders because he's going to relieve Eskom's debt. We say, no, he should question it. I'm glad it's been raised here, but it is the World Bank and KfW, the German finance agency. It's British, the Export-Import Bank of the US and France, and all these EU and US and British agencies that loaded us up with corrupt debt. It's odious because the ANC was bribed. This is not even a surprise anymore. Last week, Kyle Cohen and News 24 did two big reports, and he found where Vali Musa especially was implicated as being the kind of rationale by a German guy called Klaus-Dieter Rennert, who's Hitachi's Power Africa Europe manager and Power Europe, and then he set up Power Africa. And he gave the ANC, through Chancellor House, 25% of local ownership, an outright bribe. And it was done at the time with Vali Musa, head of the Presidential Climate Commission, right? Slapped on the wrist for his improper conflict of interest because he was Eskom chair, manipulating that particular contract because he and his mates at Eskom could decide who would get the biggest single contract in the country's history. At the same time, he was on the ANC Finance Committee, and then Chancellor House got its way in. And the documents that were just revealed last week really show this is odious debt. If you're not demanding that debt be taken on board by the corrupt lenders who knew that it was a corrupt deal, hey, we're missing out on that. I'd much rather, Dominic, I know you guys have been some of the leaders on this. I'd much rather see that be the top of the campaign priorities than pensioners taking on some of the debt. And then we've got more aspects of this rotten carrot. There may not be enough time to go through what's wrong with the JET-P, but it is basically all loans. 3% is grants. And then the loans, if you're a Yankee, you always squeeze people for maximum. That's market rate. It's over 10% a year at the moment that Eskom is paying for market rate. And the deal from the US is, oh, well, Janet Yellen, the finance minister, was just visiting us. She then says that debt will be guaranteed so that if Eskom does go bankrupt, which it well could, but it would take down so much of other South African debt. I doubt they'll allow it. But that would be guaranteed by the US. That's the kind of really sneaky, stupid deal making that was done. And yet the principle is critical that the North and South Africa, I'm here in Melville, I'm in the global North. I don't know about some of you, but I certainly have a huge climate debt. And we should be paying that climate debt, shouldn't we? And the North should be paying it to leave fossil fuels underground in Mpumalanga, as this deal posits. And of course, we should do it with Cabo Delgado, so we don't send so many troops there to defend Total, the French company, and ExxonMobil from Houston, and Eni from Rome, and China National Petroleum, who want to take blood methane, where thousands have died and 1 million people displaced. And it's that deal that we have to keep demanding, that the North pay its climate debt to the South and cancel debt. And that's called the debtforclimate.org. And we're protesting, for example, the German embassy on the 27th of February. See you at the German embassy. Don't have time for carbon markets, but they're just poison. They've worked really badly here. And of course, Treasury wants to do it. And then I've mentioned things like wheeling, and you've already talked about the fair allocation. I just want you to be very clear that for the jet P, they really, especially Andre de Ruyter, they have this blood methane addiction in mind. The decarbonization is gasification. Look at the two biggest projects, 70 billion rand for Richards Bay gas, that's 3,000 megawatts. And for Komati, they wanted, I'm not sure they still can, but they wanted 15.3 billion rand to go for 1,000 megawatts, right? Now, I really celebrate our hosts, the Climate Justice Charter Movement, bravely, I think so far alone, have said, damn it, that should not pass. While so much fossil fuel exploration is underway, these guys who got together in a place, Sharm el-Sheikh, for the Conference of the Polluters, 27, last November, the United Nations Framework Convention and Climate Change Conference of the Parties. Conference of the Polluters is simpler. And what did they have to say? Well, John Kerry, win-win-win by having 100% market rate in their part of the 8.5 billion. Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, say, yeah, we'll do 500 million US dollars equivalent. For Emmanuel Macron, the critical thing is he visited Cyril Ramaphosa in May 2021 after his company, Total, because the Total used to be a parastatal and is part and parcel of the French ruling class. And he said to Ramaphosa, and this was fairly open, we will help you on your failing campaign to get the COVID-19 vaccines and medicines taken off intellectual property, a waiver as was requested. It's a progressive position that the French slowly came to. But in exchange, Ramaphosa, okay, we'll put 1,000, maybe up to 1,500 troops into Cabo Delgado. The black bodies will come home in body bags after defending white Paris and Houston and Rome capital and Chinese capital. And of course, for van Leyden, who's the head of the EU, we just want more coal from South Africa. And Olaf Scholz, you see on the right, the German wants that, plus his really disgusting car companies, which have been cheating on their emissions. They're going to get the subsidies for the electric vehicles. We could go on about why it's a terrible deal, but I think I'll just quickly end with a couple of ideas. One is, let's talk about proper demands, because if you see the likes of Rob Hershoff outside Luthuli House last week, all they want to do in an opportunistic way with this kind of right-wing agenda is use the energy crisis to toss out the ANC and get their center-right coalitions in. And the real demands people, I think, would be making if we could really work it through. And Trevor and Terry and I spent the day in Soweto yesterday listening and figuring out where these demands, I think they might be, I mean, I'm just in my armchair hypothesizing 2 kilowatt hours per person per day, no means test, it should be universal. And if I use too much, my laptop runs about 20 hours a day, yes, you know, then I'll finish up in a couple of seconds now, Charles, I see you. Well, then I should pay much higher. Let's cut these crony special pricing agreement and stop the massive waste like Sasol squeezing coal to make a few drops of petrol. That's the #1 site of CO2 emissions in the world, a massive user. So the EIUG, I mentioned that. Stop this racist load reduction that de Ruyter introduced in the winter of 2020 in the midst of COVID. Make sure that we don't have energy apartheid that comes from the degeneration of Eskom and rich whiteys can, you know, put on solar and feed back into the grid. The ANC has a really reactionary position from Enoch Godong's office to cut women off and give them instead some expected access to gas instead of enough electricity for cooking. Stop the exploration. We had such great protests yesterday in Kabeja. We've had protests in Paris today by our comrades fighting Total. This is a really important part of the struggle, right? Stopping the fossil fuel exploration. Avoid the climate sanctions, or maybe ask for them to be imposed. Because if we get car power ships or the Eskom gas generation, well, at some point we'll be hit with harder climate sanctions because methane is 85 times worse, more potent than CO2. And then let's stop these coal experts. I think the winner of our climate champion, you know, notional award would be Portia Derby. She's the head of Transnet. She's brought the capacity 91 million, but the average has been about 80 million tons a year. And now it's down to 50 million because Transnets are so broken. Never forget, we have a massive climate debt. The climate imperialists, you see the top one, Barack Obama, doing the Copenhagen Accord. That was the critical meeting. And you see Lula da Silva, and you see Zuma, and you see Wen Jiabao and Manmohan Singh. This is where, at the global scale, let's keep in mind the energy crisis goes all the way to the top, and it'll be even worse. My very last slide. It'll be very much worse in August in Durban, because the BRICS Plus will meet. And who else is in the plus? Not just Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, with some dictatorial and imperial forces, sub-imperial forces, but also Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Kazakhstan, Algeria, Nigeria, Senegal's getting very gassed up. Indonesia's the #1 coal exporter. We're going to have a real petro-authoritarian network of dictators who come to Durban and declare themselves somehow an anti-imperialist force. We know instead of being against the catastrophic capitalist crisis, they're actually within it and actually now propelling it further. That's why we need more of what we just saw yesterday, protest, and change the balance of forces. That way, these wonderful visions that comrades like Dominic at the AIDC and that CJC have can really be feasible, because we'll have changed the balance of forces. It might take sanctions. It might take rejecting that rotten carrot. Let's talk about that. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you so much, Comrade Patrick. I see there are several comments in the chat, but we always love to hear people's voices. So please, if you have a comment or a question, you can raise your hand and engage with our panelists. We'd like to make sure that in our webinars we engage directly as much as possible. So you can raise your hand, and I will allow you to speak. Janet?
Hello.
Yes, Janet, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for all the inputs. Very good, as usual. I thought that was a bit short on how we could mobilize not just against government policies, but in terms of implementing alternatives. But I thought one thing in terms of the movement, when we talked about coal, I think Patrick's last point was around stopping coal exports, and just linking to another struggle. Do you know that 85% of South Africa's exports to Israel are made up of coal and diamonds, uncut diamonds? So surely we can combine these two campaigns and demand the sanctions against Israel, trade sanctions, and stop exporting coal to Israel. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Janet, for your comment. Ferron has already typed very good idea. To our panelists, feel free to respond to any of the comments that you have seen in the chat about elaborating some of the points that you raised. And if there are any other hands from our attendees, please raise your hands as well. Do any of our panelists like to respond to the suggestion that has just been raised by Janet? You're still muted, Patrick.
Yeah, would it be okay to take what Janet's saying, because it's absolutely correct, and just being the other night here at the Bishop Huddleston Memorial Site and seeing Hadar Aid's presentation on the oppression in Gaza. Yeah, we're way behind in connecting the dots, but I think there's a bigger solidarity question, isn't there, Janet? And you were one of my heroines when I was becoming politicized and thinking about how the apartheid regime could be overthrown. It was you and your comrades in the UDF who said, and ANC who said, sanctions. And I'm wondering what you think, if I can toss it back to you, about the scope for international solidarity. The importance of it is that the mainstream perspective is that the JETP is a nice charitable effort by the US, by UK, Germany, France, and the EU. And we're now at the point, especially today in Paris, where Total is under wonderful pressure from the Green Connection, and they brought Fisher Folk and community leaders. Where are we with that kind of solidarity? Can we hark back, and can we ask for, as CJCM has done February last year, but let me be critical, comrades, CJCM threw that out, but then didn't really follow up. didn't do the solidaristic campaigning. Israel BDS follows directly from South African sanctions against apartheid, which were quite successful in mid-1985. And we know how much Israel fears it by the virtue of the fact that they're making it illegal to advocate it, and you can't even go into the country if they Google you and find you're a BDS proponent. So yeah, let's throw it back to all of us. What can we do with the necessity now? And maybe the German, protest on the 27th of Feb is one way to do that, of evoking global solidarity.
Thank you so much, Comrade Patrick. Janet, would you like to respond?
Yes, sure. It's not clear to me in terms of global solidarity around the climate crisis. The one option would be to implement boycott of Total or Shell or BP, etc., which are you saw the record profits that BP and Shell have been making. I mean, it's just astronomical. But the whole thing about boycotts is that they're successful when there's an alternative. So we can't just call for a boycott of fossil fuel. That's not going to work. We can't call for a boycott of one company because it has to be a targeted campaign. So if Shell is doing something like engaging in mineral or gas exploitation, we can call for a boycott of Shell, but that doesn't. It was too focused for what we're looking at here. Anyway, I think we need a little bit of a strategic discussion on I don't know quite what Patrick means by engage the boycott strategy in this, or the sanction strategy. What sanctions are we talking about?
Well, there's CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So I just put a link where Des saw, and I wrote up what we thought was coming out of the Conference of Polluters 27. That is the broken stick CBAM not working as well as it potentially could, and then of course the rotten carrot. So it's on the link there. That's my explanation.
Thank you so much, Comrade Patrick. Comrade Dominic, one of the narratives that we constantly see in the media is that the Eskom fleets are failing because they are old. But you said in your presentation that is actually not one of the main reasons why the Eskom fleets are collapsing. Could you please just elaborate further on that? Because it's something we are bombarded with every day in the media.
So I'd like to see if I can find a list of the 15 coal-fired power stations. I have it somewhere, but it's not easily on hand now. And when you look at some fleets are older than some of the newly built ones, but are performing worse. And so one very clear-cut example of this is at Tutuka, where it has an energy availability factor of less than 30%. And this coal-fired power station is one that has experienced the highest levels of corruption and patronage in relation to its energy generation. So I think that if we can put in the correct incentives, checks and balances, and accountability, including revising the financing model, that in fact we could refurbish and restore the coal-fired power stations. It's important to recognize, though, that there's no quick fix. It will take some time to do and a substantial amount of resources. But even though it's a lot of resources, it's still probably the cheapest way of addressing the immediate energy gap. I quickly wanted to touch on the point of the government employees pension fund. And I just wanted to say, I mean, I agree generally with Comrade Patrick about the importance of cancelling illegitimate debts. And we often try and use the very concrete example of the 2010 World Bank loan for the building of Medupi and Kusile, which I think many now recognize had some kinds of corruption linked to it, not least to ANC's Hitachi and Chancellor House. But I think in as much as we have to push for the pushing of the cancellation of illegitimate debts, based on the doctrine of odious debts, this would require a change in government. And in the short term, we can in fact alleviate a lot of Eskom's financial pressures to deal with the immediate energy crisis on a basis that would transform it, including dealing with corruption, wiping out expensive BEE coal contracts, which would in the long run, if Eskom transforms itself as well into a renewable energy player, could have important returns on investment that would secure pensions over the future. That's one point. The second point is, if I can share my screen again quickly, it would be to show, and I know Patrick will agree with me, that currently the JSE in South Africa is overinvested in. The South African stock market is 330% the size of the real economy, or 3.3 times the size of the real economy. And a big factor in relation to this is the massive investments of the PIC, the asset manager, the GPF, into the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, where almost 2/3 of the GPF's 2.3 trillion rand is invested. And if you look at who it's being invested in, it's being invested in these big corporations that we all feel are problematic. So it's not only equity that's an issue, it's also these corporations that are generally against the interests of the working class, against the interests of climate justice, economic justice, and social justice. So my question to Comrade Patrick is that given that already 20% of Eskom's debt is held by the GPF, given that the GPF has 110% of its liabilities covered, and given that it's currently overinvested in equity, is there not good cause for a left demand to say, let's redirect this investment? So that's one thing. The second thing I think is we have to push this demand that Comrade Patrick is talking about for universal free basic electricity. This is paramount. The issue of energy crisis is a major issue. And as Ferron says, well, in the first point, the amount that's been granted is inadequate. 50 kilowatts per month per household is far below what's required for a decent standard of life. But more than that, as Ferron showed, very few people are actually receiving this free basic electricity. What's behind this is the question we must ask. And behind it is, again, the question of a neoliberal economic model that says that municipalities must raise resources by selling services and charging tariffs. And so municipalities in 2019, for example, bought electricity from Eskom to the value of 18.5 or 19 billion rand, and sold it on for more than 28 billion rand to make a profit, because they're getting too little money from national government. So unless municipalities are freed, liberated from the burden of charging people who can't afford services and tariffs from doing so, it invariably runs into the debt crisis that we're seeing. And two, it's discouraged from providing the free basic electricity that's required. One possible solution is to shift it from from an equitable share grant to a conditional share grant to compel municipalities to provide this electricity.
Thank you, Comrade Dominic. Comrade Patrick?
Yeah, full support on where Dominic's trying to go with it. And if there is a deal in which public sector workers or pensioners are with you on that, I'd love to hear about it. I would guess that given the level of consciousness to say that workers should be buying in with that surplus, instead of it being reinvested for the next crash. Don't forget we had massive stock market crashes here, 1998, 2008, 2020. And at those moments, Dominic, I think you'd probably agree that massive, let's call it a Buffett indicator, right? The 333% of the stock market capitalization to GDP, making us the most speculative stock market in the world after Hong Kong. But it can crash. And so I would get a little bit worried about then suggesting that Eskom, even though the bonds are paying well, but that it become part and parcel of a sort of, bailout. And instead, you're right that you do need to get rid of your Godongwanas and other, neoliberals who believe so much in repaying the World Bank and all the other lenders. And I think that can be done through what the World Bank fears the most and what they were victimized by in 2019, which are civil lawsuits by the victims of their loans. And Medupi loan, we're all victims. It's very easy to show, and to show that the president of the World Bank then, Robert Zoellick, knew very well about the corruption, because Valimus had already been disciplined in a very light way by the public protector for that conflict of interest. So my argument might be that this is one of those moments of terrific opportunity, because the World Bank lost its diplomatic immunity from these lawsuits in 2019, when Bangladeshis, backed by some very good environmental lawyers, did actually defeat them. And I think we should try that, and we've talked about it for quite a while. AIDC has been right at the cutting edge, and we've looked for good lawyers. But really, let's make it a social problem, because look, if these Mashinisa type of just energy transition partnership lenders, and that's the KfW from Germany, US Exim, the UK and French state banks, they're lending.
Don't forget the German bank as well.
That's KfW. Yeah, that's something for Feeder Aufbau. I can't. My German isn't good enough to remember it. KfW is the Germans, and those guys are lending Eskom new money to pay the interest on the old loans. Right, it's Mashinisa all the way. It's what we call Ponzi financing. So while we've got a lot of European attention, especially because South Africa's JETP is considered the model. Vietnam and Philippines and maybe India will start picking up this model. And Barbara Creasy is kind of writing about it today and using this as the sort of carrot that she's taking to the mining Indaba this week. And then, as I say, the stick is on the way too. This is the time for our strengthened international solidarity to force those lenders to take, as they say, take the haircut, so that they take the hit on the Medupi loans, rather than Godongwana doing it next week on the taxpayers, right?
Thank you, Comrade Patrick. Comrade Alex, I see your hand is up. You may go.
Hi, comrades. Thanks for this great discussion. Just one point quickly about the links between BDS, Israel, and fossil fuels is that there are some really exciting collaborations. In the US, there's the big push for divesting from the fossil fuel industry. And often you find student movements there collaborating with boycotting of Israel, as well as the prison industrial complex. And so there's a nice intersectional divestment organizing going on there, which we could maybe learn from. The other was a question, I think, Dominic, your point about the need to maintain the coal plants, fix them in the short term, as being a key solution to load shedding. Sounds, definitely right. But I'm wondering, in the medium to longer term, that, the amount of money that we're pouring into maintaining these coal plants might prove uneconomic versus investing in, socially owned renewable energy instead. And I say this because there was a US study that showed that I think 99% of their coal plants could be more economically replaced with wind and solar. So I wonder, what's the cost benefit analysis in terms of for how much longer do we keep pouring maintenance into these coal plants? I know in the short term we need to, but then maybe as we go more further into the future, there's a diminishing returns that happen. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alex. Comrade Dominic?
I think it's a very important question. And I feel a lot more interrogation needs to be given to what would the energy mix be to ensure sustainable energy and a decarbonized energy system. I don't have a clear-cut understanding of what that is yet. At the moment, I get a sense that there are some technical challenges in relation to renewables, in spite of the fact that as AIDC, as many of you know, we've been saying, we need a renewable energy and a socially owned renewable energy transition through a 1 million climate jobs approach for the better part of a decade. But we're seeing more and more that in terms of the private costing of renewables, and I'm assuming you're talking about socially owned, but also in general that there's going to be greater costs. And then, as you know, Alex, there's a question of capacity factor and when energy is available. And the question is to what kind of dispatchable energy would or baseload energy would be required, if any. And I now see there's a book saying actually you can run 100% renewable energy system without needing baseload energy. And I would like to read the book and see in more detail what it says. But given my impression at the moment and my current understanding is that we would need some coal and we will need Eskom at least for the better part of the next 10 years. I don't know if you agree, but I think that's something that seems to be the case. And if that is to be the case, then it would mean that we will have to definitely service and refurbish at least some of the coal-fired power stations, if not, and I'm not saying all, over the medium term, over the short term. So at the moment, until we can deal with the question of storage capacity and dealing with the question of sorry, I got distracted by Comrade Janet's question. When this energy is available, it seems that there's still some constraints, and therefore prioritizing coal and Eskom coal-fired power stations to the short to medium term seems to be the way to ensure energy sustainability.
Thanks, Dominic. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Comrade Dominic. Comrade Ferron, one of the points you raise in the Green New Eskom.
Comrades, just before you go on, would it be okay for me to chime in very, very fast on Alex's question? I think, Dominic, Comrade, you're absolutely wrong to keep going to bat for dead old power stations because you haven't done the cost benefit on two things, as far as I know. I hope I'm wrong. Because if you say that the particulates in the air of sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, these are the worst in the world and they're killing thousands a year, you're saying just do that some more, just fix them up. And by the way, the cost on that from the rater is 150 billion rand, right? That's what they want to do to refurbish these old dying coal-fired power stations. But the other thing, Dominic, wouldn't you agree, your future generations and mine will need hydrocarbons. They'll need it for lubricants. They'll need it for necessary synthetic materials, plastics. They'll need it for pharmaceutical products. They'll need it for bitumen. We can go on. Hydrocarbons are vital. We have a lot of very good quality hydrocarbons in Mpumalanga. Shouldn't future generations have those rather than you suggesting they just be taken out of the soil and burned? Because if you aren't yet asking the tough question about who's using most electricity, the EIUG, and turning off the tap to Sasol in Secunda and to BHP Billiton in Richards Bay, I'm not willing to go with you, dear comrade, on refurbishing the old dying dinosaur power plants with all the damage that they do.
I agree with you in principle, Comrade Patrick, but I think you would also agree that we have a challenge of a prematurely deindustrialized South African economy, which contributes significantly to our structural problems of mass unemployment. And so, I mean, we're going to need a lot more energy than what we currently have to power a public transport system, to transport renewable energy industries, as you're intimating at. So even if we do ration the energy intensive users group and we do say, and we take over the economy and we can collectivize and democratize the discussion about which industries we want to operate given its value add. Once you have that discussion, I think even then it will be clear we're going to need a lot more energy than what we currently have. And so I'm not saying for the indefinite future, I'm saying that for the next 5 years, and some of the fleet within obviously already, for example, Medupi and Kusile, I think is only going to be decommissioned in 2060. And there's some others that may be decommissioned in 2045, that if they decommission in 2060, when we do have the possibilities, or maybe even if it's before, then we do it before. So I'm not saying we should just, thanks, Patrick. So I'm not saying indefinite or long-term. Let's develop the technologies, localize the technologies to actually be able to advance a public pathway transition to a low-carbon economy. Let's get clear on the facts about what it's going to take to transition. Let's make sure that we're accounting for the socioeconomic questions in the transition so that we do the transition at a time and a scale that allows us to meet our climate targets, but also allows us to deal with questions of social and economic justice. And I think these principles are principles that we are aligned on. And so let's look then at the nitty-gritties and let's see what it would take to transition in a real way, without just saying what we know we need to move away from coal, because we do agree on that. But what's it going to take to do it in a real way?
Comrade Ferron, it would be great to hear what the Green New Eskom strategy says about these old coal-fired power plants.
Well, I think Alex sort of pointed to the fact that we recognize that we can't, switch off coal immediately, and that we, that the just transition needs to take into account the energy crisis, and that might take some time. But these discussions, I think, are so important, and I'm very happy that we're talking about like the details and the nitty-gritty of what we are proposing, because I think people are, fatigued by, people are angry but not quite hopeful yet, right? So they don't really have a sense of what they'd like to fight for. And I think that should be our priority, because even if we decide we want to embark on some international solidarity campaign, or solidarity with Palestinian people, a boycott campaign against sanctions on Israel, or whatever it is, the energy intensive user group, the fact is, do we have the people power? Are we organized? Do we have a base? Do we have enough agreement, a minimum program that everybody can get behind? And that's why I'm really grateful that Climate Justice Charter Movement has invited, members of Climate Justice Coalition, AIDC, the universities to this discussion. But I think we need to, and they can happen in parallel, think about what these solutions are in detail, what our campaigning priorities are, what our minimum program is, but also be considering how we bring more people into the fold, with education work, with the speak outs, with mass action. And I think one of the opportunities for that is this campaign that Clive, the Excluded, SAFTU, AMCU, Assembly of the Unemployed are talking about. Is there a way that more of us can really get behind that? Doesn't have to be our thing. It just needs to be something. And if somebody's doing something, I think we should all get together and try and support it as much as we can. Yeah, and Green New Eskom can be part of that. I'm sure comrades will agree.
Thank you so much, Comrade Ferron, and thank you so much to our panelists. I know this is a very hot topic and issue that we can discuss for the whole day, but unfortunately we have to end here. Thank you so much, comrades, for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Amandla.
Wait, two.
Thank you, comrades.
Good of you,
Take
comrades.
care.
Thank you.
And thanks for